about that and catching up. So we're going to cover today this paper. It's by the same title, Evaluating Community Solar as a Measure to Expand Equitable Clean Energy Access. This is a paper published in Nature Energy. And so with that, we're going to start with some context. My colleague Galen's going to explain how this fits into a broader set of research at the Berkeley Lab, and then we'll get started. Flash a disclaimer in front of everyone, and then if Galen, you want to kick us off.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Eric. And welcome, everybody. So I'm just going to speak for a brief moment here. And really the purpose of my interlude is just to frame the research that we're going to talk about today within kind of the context of the broader set of energy equity related research that's underway within the Energy Markets and Policy Department at LBL. EMP, Energy Markets and Policy Department, where Eric and I reside at LBL. We have research staff working on really a wide variety of different topics related to energy equity. One major thread, which is what Eric and I focus on for the most part, really looks at the distributed solar market. And so we've got a wide variety of different research products we put out over the years, focusing on energy equity issues within that space in particular. One foundational element that a lot of our work builds upon is our annual solar demographics market tracking report. This is an annual report that our colleague Sydney Forrester leads and that Eric and I are both a part of as well. And the purpose of that report is really just to kind of describe basic trends in terms of how the residential rooftop solar market is evolving along various different demographic dimensions. As part of that annual report, we assemble and maintain this large underlying data set of residential rooftop solar adopters across the country, combined with demographic and income related information about those households. And that data set forms the basis for a lot of the research that we do. It was one of the key components in the work that we're going to talk about today. And I would really just to pivot back to Eric, would just note that much of the research that we've done within the solar market has really focused, at least within the residential solar market, is focused on rooftop solar adopters. The paper that we're going to share with you today expands that purview to look at adoption equity among community solar adopters as well, and kind of how those compare to rooftop adopters. And so this is one of our first forays into this space. And we were really excited to be able to conduct this research. So with that, I'm going to hand things back to Eric.
Great. Thanks, Galen. So to start here, this is all the information that you could need about this publication. I always like to try to emphasize these webinars, we try to tackle a lot. So if you miss anything, there's no need to be furiously scribbling down notes. It's all available. There's the study itself in this homepage at LBL. There's the publication. There's a preprint version at that study homepage. The preprint is pretty close to the final version. For those with access to the Nature journal, they get the publication there at that link. And then we have the summary blog. And I always forget to kick off. So I am Eric O'Shaughnessy. You just heard from my colleague Galen Barbos. And then we collaborated on this project with our colleagues at the National Renewable Energy Lab, Suda Kanan and Jenny Sumner. So with that, let's get into this. And I need to start here. So as Galen mentioned, we do most of our work, at least in this area, on rooftop solar. So when we say rooftop solar, really, that's a shorthand for small scale for the most part. We're talking about a single system on, say, a home that is powering that home, and for all intents and purposes, nothing else. Community solar, this is something where definitions really matter because community solar is more than anything else an idea. It's not a specific scale. It's not how it's installed. It really refers to how it is sold. And I see one thing in the chat. So do we share? There is a Q&A. So all right, that's Galen. Yeah, make sure there will be a Q&A at the end. So do add questions. and we'll get to them at the end. So I put here, it's kind of long, but I want to be sure we're on the same page. We're kind of following the US Department of Energy definition. The key part here is that it's a solar project in which the benefits flow to multiple customers. So as opposed to flowing to one household, this is a project where it's flowing to multiple customers. And then really, this is part of the same definition from DOE. Community solar is a form of generation that allows community members of all types to access meaningful benefits of renewable energy. So this idea of access is really foundational to the identity of community solar. And there's this link here to the National Community Solar Partnership, which has a lot more resources on what DOE is doing with community solar. So that's community solar, and really emphasizing there that this idea of access, getting people to be able to access clean energy is foundational to what community solar kind of is, what this industry perceives itself is in the United States. Now that we can all sort of agree on what community solar is, I like to summarize findings up front, and then I'll unpack these for the next 30 minutes or so. So community solar, as I mentioned, it's often theorized. It's to expand solar access. It's part of how that industry sees itself. It's to some degree taken for granted that community solar expands access to underserved communities. So we decided to study that question by comparing the demographic characteristics of community solar and rooftop solar adopters. Get into exactly how we did that, but really the key takeaways that we'll get to throughout the course of this webinar is that community solar adopters look a lot different than rooftop solar adopters. They're much more likely to live in multifamily housing, much more likely to rent and earn less income. The data suggests that the access benefits are primarily in terms of housing type, that is single versus multifamily, and housing tenure, own versus rent. And we also test what explains these demographic differences. Is it something about the business model, something about policy? And we broadly conclude that it is both. So we have this one summary figure that if you can just drill this into your head, this is kind of the key theme with some numbers. I heard this nice quote in an interview earlier that it's more about the music than the lyrics. There's going to be a lot of numbers in this webinar, but really we're trying to get at a broad story here about access. The numbers matter, but with an order of magnitude is what we're talking about here. So the three key stats to bear in mind is that relative to rooftop solar, community solar adopters are about 6 times more likely to live in multifamily housing. They're about 4 times more likely to rent, and they earn about 20% less annual income. And we'll talk a bit about the significance of all of this. So to give us some background, rooftop solar, over 4 million households had adopted rooftop solar by the end of 2023. The expansion has, by all means, been quite impressive. But by now, it's well understood that rooftop solar has not been equitably distributed with respect to income, housing type, tenure, and race, ethnicity. Lots of research demonstrating this. And I really like this figure shown here because it describes a lot of what is going on. So the figure shows the percent of solar adopters that earn less than the US median income. If solar were randomly distributed, that number should be 50%. But we see that it's consistently less than, meaning that low and moderate income LMI adopters are significantly underrepresented. But 2 things to observe. One, it's going up over time. So there's a lot more LMI adoption today than there was 20 years ago. And really important to keep your eye on is that it's going up as there's more deployment. So there's a clear relationship between the number of systems installed and LMI adoption. And that's a real relationship. So solar, like other technologies, as it diffuses, as it reaches more households, it tends to become more equitable. Early on, technologies tend to be expensive, costs go down, and it becomes more equitable. That's the pattern you'd expect to see of solar or any other emerging technology. All of that said, there are some unique barriers to solar that make us question if we're ever really going to achieve that 50% true equity mark, particularly in terms of barriers for renters and multifamily housing occupants. It's been a puzzle people have been working on for a long time, but it still remains very, very difficult for renters and households living in multifamily housing to adopt rooftop solar. to a lesser extent income. We've done research showing that there's various ways that you kind of remove income barriers, but those barriers for housing type and tenure are still very firm in rooftop solar. Which brings us to community solar. So community solar is often theorized as a way to solve this problem of adoption inequity. And it is a problem for reasons that we've talked about in our research, insofar as adoption equity can discourage solar policy, it can create bad perceptions, it can slow down deployment. There's lots of addition. I said a couple of minutes ago, to some extent, it's normal. It's an expected outcome. This is not something that's unique to solar, but it still poses a policy problem for various reasons. So maybe community solar can help with this. For community solar, you don't need to own a home. You don't need unique access to a rooftop. And the upfront costs of community solar tend to be much lower. So for all these reasons, just intuitively, it seems that community solar should promote more equitable access to solar. But we're research and we look skeptical at all of these things. And so we began to wonder, well, is that true? And there really is not good empirical evidence up till now that that was the case. And there's good reasons to suspect that maybe it's not. Community solar is, like rooftop solar, largely a profit maximizing business. Competitive constraints would suggest that maybe community solar is going to look a lot like rooftop solar. So there's a good reason to question, is this true? To what extent is it true? And how much should we really be supporting community solar as a measure to promote equitable access? A secondary question is, insofar as it does appear to expand access, meaning promote adoption among underserved communities, is that because of something about community solar or something about policy? So we have this confounding factor that a lot of states have promoted community solar and then supported policies to support low-income community solar specifically. So for example, a state might say, we'll allow virtual net metering, the type of policy that enables community solar. But the deal is community solar project developers need to reserve a certain share for low-income adopters. So you have this really favorable policy environment that kind of muddles the signal. So is community solar inherently more equitable, or is it just because of these additional policy measures? That's the secondary question we explore. So we gather a bunch of data, and this study was unique and kind of fun because it was the first time that we combined these two big data sets from two different labs. So at the Berkeley Lab, we took rooftop solar data. This is from, as Galen mentioned, our annual solar demographics tracking report. A lot of that data is available in some shape or form, either at the household level through our Tracking the Sun project, or some track level data through solar demographics at the links we showed earlier. And we combined it with the data, these data that is collected by the National Renewable Energy Lab, led by our colleagues Sudha Khanna and Jenny Sumner. And so NREL is collecting these data on community solar projects, as well as customer level, or what in community solar are called subscribers. And we also collected community solar data directly from 4 state programs. The numbers here, the sample sizes, they're much smaller than the full population. And the reason is this third bullet. For reasons we'll get into in a second, we limited our study to data from states with at least 100 adopters of both types. And then the final point on data is that we use modeled demographic data. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this point. We talk about this a lot in other research. You can read more about it in solar demographics. The point being that some of the demographics, particularly income and race, when I get to talk about that, they reflect modeled estimates, meaning that they're correct on average. We vetted them, they're good, they're reliable, but they're not observed in the sense of you go and knock on someone's door and ask them how much they earn. So there's some important caveats with that we discuss in the study. To give you a flavor of the sample, here are the states that we explored, again, where we had at least 100 adopters of both types. The numbers here, these are not the full market in each state. There's some drops based on where states were able to get certain data, but we have pretty good coverage. And another point to note here is that we're covering some of the main community solar markets. So we felt pretty good about the representativeness of the sample for community solar. You have states like Colorado, Massachusetts, New York, big community solar states. But clearly what is missing from this are California and Hawaii, two of the big obvious rooftop solar states. Various reasons for that. But just to note that the sample here, we weren't trying to be geographically representative. So one thing we're going to do consistently is not focus too much on the results from any one state. We're trying to build a picture nationally based on this limited sample, so we don't focus too much on maybe one result from Colorado. The goal here is to get the bigger picture view. So the way we do this is we statistically compare the demographic characteristics of the two adopter groups, meaning community solar and rooftop solar. And then we apply some techniques to try to factor out the role of policy, test the secondary question of what is driving the demographic differences, and then think about the potential role of community solar in expanding solar access. We do this through one-sided statistical tests. So for those of you who haven't thought about what a one-sided test means in a long time, essentially we have these prior hypotheses about what we think community solar should do. So for instance, we think based on DOE definition, all of this, that community solar probably should be reaching lower income households. So we make the one-sided hypothesis, community solar adopters earn less than rooftop solar adopters. The reason for the one-sided is it's a bit stricter. So we're limiting ourselves. We're not saying our community solar is different. We're asking, are they different in a very specific way? It's a bit more of a rigorous statistical test to make sure that we're getting the answer we think we are getting. And we do all these tests, and the key assumption here is if you think about it, just showing that, say, community solar adopters earn less, that doesn't mean they expand access per se. You need to add this additional assumption that at least some of those adopters would not have adopted rooftop solar. So for instance, as we'll show, and as I mentioned earlier, community solar adopters are much more likely to rent. We can conclude or infer that community solar is expanding access because most of those rooftop solar, if not all of those rooftop community solar renters, likely would not have adopted rooftop solar. So that's the inference that allows us to say that community solar is expanding access. And again, these are assumptions that we lay out in the paper. And then we do some other models just to say, well, which factor is really explaining these relationships? And then we will conclude with some analysis on different subsets of the policy impacts. A whirlwind of methodology. Again, lots more details in the paper for those who are curious about that. So let's get into results. This is kind of a heavy hitting figure, so I'll hover on this slide for a bit because we'll see this format of this figure 2 more times in the presentation. So here we're showing 4 different demographic characteristics: income, median income levels, the percent renter, the percent living multifamily, and percent people of color or Hispanic. This was published in Nature Energy, so they use the British style of the color with the U, which is why you see it there. And the orange diamonds in all these figures are community solar. The blue circles are rooftop solar, and those kind of teal triangles is the statewide average. So just to begin with income, what we see more or less across the board is that the orange diamonds, community solar, fall somewhere between rooftop solar and the statewide average, meaning that community solar adopters tend to earn less than rooftop solar adopters, but they still tend to earn more than the statewide median income. So it's to suggest that community solar appears more equitable relative to rooftop solar, but we still can't exactly conclude that it is equitable. These are relatively higher earning income households on average. And the solid diamonds are statistically significant. So in all cases where you see the community solar is a lot lower than the rooftop solar, it's going to be statistically significant according to these one-sided tests. The hollow diamonds, the white ones, are insignificant. So for instance, in DC and Rhode Island, we do not see a statistically significant difference in income. But for the most part, we do. Moving on to the other ones, now that we kind of have that intuition established, renters, we again see really big differences. Community solar adopters are a lot more likely to rent. They're meaning that those orange diamonds are way above the blue circles, hovering down to the bottom. Again, rooftop solar is pretty inaccessible for renters. Community solar has no specific barriers, so it's clearly doing a better job of reaching renters. But again, still not quite to the statewide average in most states. Same thing in multifamily buildings. We see across the board that these orange diamonds are far above the blue circles. Community solar adopters are much more likely to live in multifamily housing. Yeah, this kind of curious case of New York. New York is a bit of an exception in the data just because of the way that the state geography is. You have a really big rooftop solar market in downstate New York, around New York City. And the community solar market is mostly upstate, outside of New York City, which is to say that the rooftop solar market is actually a bit more in urban areas. You have a lot of multifamily housing in New York that can adopt rooftop solar, and quite the opposite in upstate. So New York is kind of an interesting exception, but for the most part, we see that community solar is kind of doing what we would expect it to. Which brings us to the last result we looked at, the last dimension is race. This is based on an algorithm that predicts race based on household last name and census tract. And we have found that that algorithm works better if we simply bifurcate into households that identify as white versus all other. So that's this percent of color Hispanic. This is all races other than white. Here, again, the one-sided hypothesis was community solar should be expanding access, that households of color or Hispanic households should be more likely to adopt community solar. We really don't see that, any evidence of that, if you look at just the figure in aggregate. So it's not necessarily, we didn't test the opposite way. It's not that they're less effective, but there's no evidence to suggest that community solar is expanding access in terms of race. And one brief note, there's no triangles here because there's really no meaningful way to compare that algorithm that we use to census data, which is why we omitted the statewide comparison in this figure for race. So that was all of those in isolation. We were kind of curious, well, those all correlate. Low-income households are more likely to live in multifamily housing, more likely to rent. There's all these correlations among different demographic factors. So we use a statistical model to determine which one of these demographic dimensions is really explaining these differences. And that model suggests that in general, it's the housing tenure, meaning do the household rent or own, and housing type that really seem to be the stronger factors, as opposed to income. And then we have this interesting result on race that goes the exact opposite direction of our hypothesis. So we'll leave race mostly aside for the next few slides. I'll return to it at the end with some speculation as we do in the paper, but really going to focus on those other three results: housing type, housing tenure, and income. So one thing we were curious about is, well, what can explain these differences? Why does it seem like community solar is more effective in terms of housing type and tenure than income? And I mentioned early on that in the rooftop solar space, to some extent, the income barrier has been eroded over time. We've done research showing that one really important business model for low-income rooftop solar is leasing. So this is where a household adopts a system. It's owned by a third party, so there's no upfront cost or very low upfront cost, and the customer makes ongoing payments, similar to leasing a car. That business model is generally more accessible to budget-constrained households because there's no upfront costs. So to some extent, leasing is one example of a way that we've addressed barriers to low-income rooftop solar adoption, but there's been nothing like that for renter or multifamily housing occupants. So we explored this kind of hypothesis. Well, maybe one reason for these differences is that to some extent, we've made inroads and progress on low-income barriers and haven't in these other areas. And the data definitely bear that out. So in this case, these blue triangles are rooftop solar lessees. These are adopters that are leasing rather than owning their panels. And if we begin over on the left, we see that the blue triangles are much closer to these orange diamonds. That is that rooftop solar lessees, their income levels are more comparable to community solar adopters than our rooftop solar owners. But you don't really see anything like that in terms of renter and multifamily. There's still this big gap. So it's all to say that the evidence suggests that there's something to this idea that we've made a lot more progress in terms of addressing income-related barriers, but because we haven't made good progress in terms of barriers to renters and multifamily housing occupants, that community solar seems to be filling that niche. It's the most logical market niche for community solar to fill. So just to flash this one more time, make sure it's seared into our minds before advancing to this secondary question. At a high level, the key takeaways for that first part, community solar adopters are more likely to live in multifamily housing, more likely to rent, and earn less income. And again, if we assume, which is a good assumption, that a lot of multifamily housing community solar adopters, a lot of renters, would not have otherwise adopted rooftop solar, we can safely conclude that community solar has expanded access to those populations. There's something like that for income. The inference is probably a bit weaker, but still there. So now we pivot to this second question. We're about halfway through, so I have plenty of time for Q&A. Pivot to the second question about what explains these differences. Is it something inherent to the community solar business model, which is kind of the story that most people say, well, there's low upfront costs, there's no barriers to renters. It's really about community solar that inherently expands access. We refer to these as inherent impacts. Alternatively, maybe this is about policy. So again, we're not really comparing apples to apples in the study because there's a lot more policy to support low-income community solar adoption than there is policy to support low-income rooftop solar adoption. Lots of reasons for that, but essentially across the board in our sample, we have states that have to some extent enabled low-income community solar adoption. So this question is, are we really seeing just these inherent impacts, or are the results skewed by policy? So we came up with this idea to try to isolate this by analyzing demographic differences for subsets of adopters. And we could do this in 3 states, Illinois, New York, and Oregon, based on the data that those programs provided us. So those programs helped us to identify which community solar adopters participated in or benefited from low-income community solar policies. We call those participants, and those that didn't, the non-participants. And we can use these differences to make some conclusions about inherent versus policy impacts. So differences between non-participant and rooftop solar adopters are consistent with inherent impacts. So if you look at here, these orange squares, so there's a lot of different shapes, but we're trying to keep it the same colors. The orange squares are community solar non-participants. These are folks that did not receive any sort of benefit. They didn't participate in an LMI program. And again, the blue circles are rooftop solar. So across the board, we still see that these orange squares are generally significantly different than the blue circles in terms of income, housing type, and tenure, which is to say that community solar adopters, regardless of whether they receive this additional LMI policy support, they're still different. So this is evidence for inherent impacts, that community solar does seem to be expanding solar access regardless of any additional policy. We also see evidence for policy impacts. So the downward orange triangles are the community solar LMI program participants. And the key difference here is the difference between the orange triangles and the orange squares. So again, across the board, we see significant differences in those. So as an example, in the percent renter up in the panel B, LMI program participants are a lot more likely to rent than our non-participants. That suggests that the LMI program is further expanding access. So you have this inherent benefit from community solar as a business model. You have these policies that can take that further. And one interesting bit that we look into a bit in the paper is that you also see that in terms of race and ethnicity. So program participants are more likely, significantly more likely, to identify as a household of color or Hispanic than our non-participants. And in 2 of the states, they're more so than rooftop solar adopters. So what that suggests is that there's something about the LMI programs that are helping community solar programs reach different demographic dimensions that the business model is not achieving on its own. Again, we can only speculate a bit on that. We do a bit more in the paper. I'll return to it in a second. But that's the results. So again, evidence for both inherent policy impacts. And we kind of wanted to put some numbers on this. So we have to make this little assumption about free riding. Free riding has this kind of negative ring to it, but that's not the way it's meant. It's just a statistical term that is basically to say, are the households, the adopters participating in the LMI programs, would they have adopted anyways? That is to say, did they need the incentive to adopt, or did they just benefit from the incentive and it just helped them adopt anyways? For reasons we explain in the paper, we think that free riding is probably pretty minimal. There's evidence to suggest that. And if you can make that assumption, we estimate that around 2/3 of the differences in income are explained by LMI programs. LMI programs explain around 40% of the differences in housing tenure, rent versus own, and 23% of the differences in housing type. So again, it seems that something about the community solar business model is really expanding access in terms of housing type and tenure, less so in terms of income. The income differences are more strongly driven by these policies, which makes perfect sense because the policies are designed around income. So to conclude, wrap this up and then we'll get to Q&A. The evidence definitely bears out our hypotheses and our expectations. Community solar does reach populations underserved by rooftop solar, primarily in terms of reaching renters and multifamily building occupants, and to a lesser extent among low-income households. In contrast, we don't find any evidence that that holds in terms of race and ethnicity. We speculate a bit on this in the paper. If anyone has any interesting new ideas to explain this, feel free to drop it into the Q&A. We've shared this result with many stakeholders, with community solar groups. And a common note that comes up is that racial minorities may be more skeptical of community solar marketing. We have no way to test this, but there's other literature that says that houses of color are more likely to be victimized by predatory marketing. And you can imagine someone knocks on your door and says, I'm going to give you cheaper electricity. You don't have to do anything. Just sign your name here. There's no upfront costs. You don't have to install a system on your home. It might sound too good to be true. And it's anecdotal, but it certainly has, we've heard from installers that it can be difficult to market this product for that reason. It has a veneer of this can't be real to it. If so, that's a real challenge, and it's a barrier that can be explored in further research. And then on the secondary question, we find evidence for both. So we find that community solar does seem to just inherently expand access. This kind of corroborates the theories about community solar and its identity, as I mentioned early on. And maybe also good news, policy does appear to work. So you can use policy like LMI programs, carve-outs, incentives, those sort of programs to take the inherent access benefits of community solar and expand them. So with that, we'll flash some acknowledgements here and lots of time for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Eric. I will run through some of the questions that folks have contributed. Certainly, I think we will have time for a few more. So if any of you have additional questions, please feel free to enter it into the Q&A box, and we'll get through as many of these as we can. First question, and actually the questioner later withdrew this, but I think it's still a good question to ask. The question is, what about people who live in a house they own but aren't able to install rooftop solar because they don't have the right orientation to the sun? And I can take the first crack at answering this. So in the very first results slide that Eric showed, we saw that community solar does a better job than rooftop solar reaching renters, does a better job at reaching residents in multifamily housing, but still a fairly significant number of community solar participants live in single family owner occupied homes. And so that still is a big part of the community solar market. In many places, the majority of the community solar market, and there are various reasons why somebody living in a single family home that they own might choose to participate in community solar rather than install a system on their own roof. And one might be this very issue mentioned here, that they don't have the right roof orientation, they have too much shading, maybe their roof is going to need to be replaced in 5 or 10 years, and they don't feel like undertaking that right now, but they want to go solar while they have the opportunity. So all sorts of different reasons why community solar might make sense for certain single family owner occupied households as well.
Yeah.
Eric, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Great answer. And I would just add to that, that's part of the reason for our initial skepticism that I mentioned earlier. One factor when people say community solar is reaching these other populations is that there's nothing stopping a prospective rooftop solar adopter from just deciding they want community solar instead. And it could be because, right, they don't have the right roof orientation, but it could just be they just don't like the way panels look. That's a very, very common reason that people don't adopt rooftop solar. So that was kind of the basis for the study to say, is this actually expanding access because it's competing with folks that probably could, but choose not to adopt rooftop solar. But the data suggests that by and large, that's not wiping out these access benefits.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to do one straightforward question and then one that's a little bit more out of the box. First, the more straightforward one, how do condo owners fit into this community solar analysis? They are not necessarily low income, but still don't have the ability to install solar on their individual condo unit. That's a great point. As a general matter, condos we classify as multifamily, really for the reason kind of noted in the question here. And although I would say we don't really have the data to kind of comprehensively parse out all of the multifamily participants into different types of multifamily buildings, condos versus apartment complexes versus triplexes, etc. We do know, at least for rooftop adopters, and you can see here that there are some fraction of rooftop adopters that live in multifamily buildings. Those are the circles in the bottom left figure. That a very large fraction of those are condo owners. And so these may be instances where the condo is individually metered and they are able or have ownership over their own rooftop. But these are generally not low income households. So certainly within the rooftop market, we know that a very large fraction of the multifamily adopters are condo residents that are relatively affluent. I would say we don't really know whether or not that's the case for community solar, but I think the research that we've conducted here would suggest that it's much less true in that sector. Anything you wanted to add there?
No.
Okay. Okay, so this is a kind of a fun question that I'm going to immediately let you answer, Eric. The question is, I'm wondering as well. So thank you for explaining the motivations for an empirical quantitative study. I'm wondering, based on what researchers now know, what are some ways in which a qualitative project, mobilizing interviews, etc., might add to answering your research questions about access to solar?
Great question. This is something that obviously we think about a lot. We do mostly quantitative work. And at the end of a study like this, we have so many questions. And that's, I think, where qualitative work picks up the baton. So on this slide here, you can look at all this. And as I mentioned, great. So we have the orange diamonds are heading in the right direction, but they don't quite get to the destination, let's say. And we don't really know why. I don't think we're ever going to get the full answer looking just at the data, no matter how large the data set is. In the example of the race ethnicity result, especially, we can speculate, but we only get so far. So a qualitative research study interviewing community solar adopters, understanding what were their reasons for their choices, rooftop solar adopters, especially those that chose not to, people that thought about but did not choose to adopt community solar, would be fascinating to understand what are the remaining barriers here. It's not because of an income issue. It's not because of renter or multifamily housing issue. So what it does explain the remaining gaps? I think qualitative research would be great for that.
Yeah, no, that's great, Eric. And we do incidentally have some work that is just getting underway that does involve conducting some kind of qualitative based research, focusing on parts of the country where we've observed kind of uniquely high levels of adoption equity, trying to understand some of the factors and causes there. And let's see. So a couple just quick kind of clarifying questions. One person asked, how can we get access to the paper? Before we end, Eric, I think you can flash back to the URL where folks can access the paper. But I think probably the simplest thing is just to type in the title of the paper and also the title of the webinar into Google, and that should hopefully turn up the paper for you. It's not open access, but Nature Energy has made accessible and online viewable version. You can't download it or print it, but anybody can view it online. Yeah, there you go. Another clarifying question. Multifamily housing, does this category include only renters or rent-own mix? What do you know about whether this category includes public housing and or income-supported housing? With respect to the first question there, certainly multifamily, it does include some combination of renters and owners. It's primarily renters, but not exclusively so. Regarding the question about public housing, so we didn't explore that specifically. I think that's an interesting question, and there are data sets out there that identify public housing units, and there might be some opportunities to kind of dig deeper into some of the multifamily adoption data, both on the rooftop and community solar side, to understand sort of kind of to what extent those might include kind of public housing and income supported housing. So I think that's not something we looked at here, but that's a great question. Here's another question. This one relates to financing. Have you studied the sources of financing for all these markets studied? Berkeley Lab has studied the credit scores of existing solar installations. The average FICO score is 740. Can you illuminate ideas studied or areas to study for community solar with respect to current financing practices in the US today?
I think maybe the short answer is that community solar puts the financing burden on the project manager, as they're called in the community solar space. So unlike rooftop solar, where if you're going to buy it, you have to come up with something on the order of $20,000 or get a loan, which is increasingly common today to finance it. The community solar, it's really a lot more like signing a subscription. So it's not financing per se, at least that's not on the subscriber, the customer to worry about. It is on the manager to worry about. The challenge of community solar is convincing an investor that you have a stable enough base of subscribers to get financing for the project. But that's kind of a different scale of finance than is required here. So I think that's part of the beauty of community solar and why it helps expand access. And in terms of the credit scores, we are curious about this. We're doing some research on credit scores as noted here, and it would be interesting to explore that for community solar as well. If that's part of the barrier to rooftop solar, it would stand to reason, based on what we found here, that community solar adopters might have lower credit scores on average.
Yeah, and one key thing to note is that in the past we have collected data on credit scores of rooftop solar adopters. We haven't done that in a while, and in the interim, the market has really moved pretty heavily towards loan financing. And so, one question that at least is unexplored, I think, from our perspective or from our research, is how the credit profile of solar adopters has changed as the market has moved more heavily towards a loan financing model. And this is something that, as Eric alluded to, we'll be starting to look at in some upcoming research. So, I mean, that really pretty much takes care of all the questions. There are a couple other comments in here that I think really just speak to some of the challenges in marketing community solar and in kind of educating consumers around what community solar is. It's kind of an unusual business model, and for folks that don't work in the industry, it can be a little challenging to sort of get your mind around and to explain to a household that otherwise isn't really familiar with this space. So certainly that's a significant factor impacting the community solar market. So I think, Eric, unless there were any other last comments that you wanted to include, that seems to wrap things up here.
Yeah, I would just say, Raymond, feel free to send us your anecdotes about your experience. That's the comment about how it can be difficult to market community solar, which is sort of counterintuitive, but really, really interesting. And it's something that we're kind of curious about, that you have a product that is almost so good. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's supported by policy. It's kind of in some sense subsidized, but it's so good that it can be hard to sell. So it's an interesting new barrier, but probably a good challenge to have. But yeah, so you have all the information here. I encourage everyone to check it out. Our contact info, I realized I didn't leave it at the end, but we are very easy to find. So feel free to reach out to us with any questions after the webinar, and just thanks for attending.
Yep, thanks everybody.